The creature had been old when the first humans stood upright on the cooling mud of a proto-continent and squinted at a sky full of things they didn't yet have words for. It was old when the last of the great thunder lizards choked on volcanic ash and sank into sediment that would become oil. It was ancient when the first stone was deliberately shaped, when the first fire was deliberately fed, when the first word was deliberately spoken to mean something other than fear. And it was still alive, and still hungry, and still entirely indifferent to the small warm things that had recently begun descending into its world in metal shells. Jonas Vale pressed his palm flat against the observation port of the submersible and watched the darkness below the thermocline swallow the exterior lights as if they were nothing. His breath fogged the reinforced composite. 14 kilometers below the surface of Ithara, in the gravitational trench that girdled the alien ocean world like a scar that would never heal, the pressure was enough to crush an unarmored human being into something unrecognizable in under 4 seconds. He had done the math once, during an insomniac night 3 weeks into the mission, and then deliberately never done it again. "You're fogging the port," said Mira from the pilot's seat. She didn't look up from her instruments. "I know. You do it every descent. I know that too." Mira Chenchin was the deep submersible pilot in the RIM Cooperative's entire survey division, and she had the detached, patient quality of someone who had spent too many hours in small spaces with people who were scared and needed to pretend they weren't. She adjusted the descent angle by 3 degrees and said nothing more. Jonas appreciated that about her more than he could articulate. The second sub, running 30 meters off their port side, carried Dr. Leor Katz and his research team, along with Sina, Jonas's ward, the 14-year-old daughter of the mission's founder, raised since infancy in the research compound on the surface station. Sina had no business being in that sub. Jonas had told her that. She had agreed, nodded, said goodnight, and then stowed herself inside the equipment bay of Sub 2 sometime before 0400. By the time anyone found her, they were already at 3 kilometers, and turning back was a 2-hour operation that Mission Command had declined to authorize. He had been furious. He was still furious, in the distant filed-away way that was all he could afford right now. Below them, something vast moved through the black. The Veteran Trench had been discovered 8 years ago by an unmanned probe that had sent back 60 seconds of footage before its hull failed. In those 60 seconds, the scientific community of 12 inhabited worlds had gone very quiet for a very long time. The footage showed creatures, large ones, the kind that made the xenobiologists lean forward and the deep ocean engineers lean back and reach for their drinks. The RIM Cooperative had sent the first crewed mission 4 years later. Jonas had been on that mission. He had come back from it with 3 fewer colleagues than he'd descended with. A recurring nightmare about the color of the water at the moment the first attack happened, and a very specific, very practiced ability to push both of those things into a compartment in his mind that he kept locked. Now he was back. There was more funding this time, better equipment, and a directive from the Cooperative Council that read, in the clean bureaucratic language of people who had never been 14 kilometers underwater on an alien world. Expand the survey perimeter. He had told them what was down there. He had filed 17 reports, given 4 testimonies, and once raised his voice in a closed session in a way that had made 2 council members flinch. They had nodded. They had expressed concern. They had signed the funding authorization and sent him back anyway. This was the job. The vault, that was what the research team called the mana station on the surface. 600 meters of pressurized corridors and lab space anchored to a platform above the trench, had been running the mission for 11 months. Dov and Cassian were up there now, watching the telemetry feeds. Dov would be eating something terrible from the station's galley and making commentary that nobody had asked for. Cassian would be checking the communications protocols for the 4th time this shift, and not saying what he was actually thinking about. What he was actually thinking about was the encrypted channel that had opened 3 weeks ago, unscheduled, routed through a relay buoy that had not been on any of the mission's filed equipment manifests. Jonas had found out about it 48 hours ago. He had said nothing yet. He was still thinking. Thermocline in 90 seconds, Mira said. The thermocline on Vithara was not like the thermoclines in human-explored oceans. It was a hard boundary, a wall of chemistry and pressure and temperature differential that the creatures of the deep trench had never crossed in the recorded history of the planet's survey. Everything that lived below it had evolved in a sealed ecosystem for hundreds of millions of years, untouched by the surface world above. The scientific term was chrono-isolated biosphere. What it meant in practice was that everything below it was operating on its own evolutionary rules in the dark, with no concept of the things that lived above. Until recently. Contact, Mira said, and her voice had gone flat and careful the way it did when she was managing her own reaction. Bearing 270, fast mover. Very fast. Jonas was already at the instrument panel. The acoustic signature was enormous, not sub-2, not any piece of station equipment, not anything they had deployed. It was organic. It was large enough that the return signal had taken the system a full 0.2 of a second to process, which meant the onboard AI had initially assumed it was a geological feature. It was not a geological feature. Heiku, Jonas said quietly. The Vetheran apex. In the xenobiological catalog, it had a 17-syllable designation that nobody ever used. The survey team that named it had been led by Dr. Rhea Hake, who had died in the first descent, and who had, in the 3 seconds between the first sonar return and the event that ended her survey career, managed to upload a complete acoustic profile and the first words, "It is magnificent. It is so," that was all. The creature that bore her name was approximately 48 meters from snout to tail. Gave or take the measurement uncertainty that came from trying to measure something that was actively trying to destroy your instruments. It had no eyes. It navigated by a form of electroreception so sensitive it could track the bioelectric signature of a human heartbeat through 20 meters of composite hull. It was the undisputed apex predator of the Vetheran Trench ecosystem, and it had, in the 4 years since the cooperative had begun mounting crewed descents, destroyed 11 survey vehicles. This one, Jonas knew, had argued to the council, had filed reports about, had raised his voice about in closed session, was not alone. The first time he had descended into the trench, the Heiku had been solitary. A single apex predator patrolling a territory that spanned 160 kilometers of the trench floor. The acoustic profile had been consistent, predictable. One signature, one animal, one set of behavioral patterns that his team had cataloged with painstaking care over 300 hours of observation. What the unmanned depth probes had found in the past 6 months was a different story. 3 signatures. Possibly more. The behavioral data suggested something that the xenobiologists, in the careful language of people who wanted to be taken seriously, called reproductive aggregation. What it meant in non-careful language was that the Heiku had mated. There were, Jonas believed, offspring somewhere in the lower trench, and the adult he was currently tracking was between him and sub-2. All stop, he said. Right now. All stop and go dark. Mira cut the drives without argument. The sub went silent and cold, running on minimal power, a dark shape in darker water. On the secondary screen, sub-2's transponder signal showed them doing the same. Lior was good. He'd read the situation. For 40 seconds, nobody breathed particularly loudly. The acoustic signature swelled on the passive sensors, peaked, and then, slowly, like a decision being unmade, receded toward the trench floor. Jonas let out a breath that tasted like adrenaline. It went down, Mira said. It went down. Why did it go down? I don't know. He stared at the sensor return. That's what worries me. They reached the trench floor at 13:47 local station time. The bottom of the Vetheran Trench was not the featureless abyss that people who had never been there imagined. It was geological theater. Hydrothermal ridges venting superheated mineral columns into the frigid water, ancient impact craters filled with silt so fine it moved like smoke when disturbed, bioluminescent colonies of filter feeders, the carpeting flat rock faces in shifting blues and greens that were the only natural light source for 14 kilometers in any direction. It was, objectively, one of the most extraordinary environments ever documented in the history of xenobiological survey. It was also where, approximately 900 meters to their northwest, Jonas's passive sensors had just resolved something that should not have been there. A structure, artificial, not theirs. He looked at the return for a long time without saying anything. Jonas, Mira said, I see it. That's not cooperative equipment. No, it's been there a while. Look at the settlement layer on the base struts. She was right. Whatever it was, it had been installed months ago at minimum, possibly longer. It was compact. A processing station of some kind, he thought, though the profile was unfamiliar. 3 large cargo modules, a pressurized crew section, and what appeared to be a drilling apparatus sunk into the trench wall. He was still thinking about the unscheduled encrypted relay buoy. Don't approach it, he said. Hold position. I'm going to raise the vault. He didn't reach the vault. The channel opened before he could key the transmitter, and the voice that came through was not Dov's. Dr. Vale. Male, accented with the flat vowels of the outer reach colonies. Calm. The calm of someone who had already decided what was going to happen next. I'm going to ask you to power down your drives and maintain your current position. Jonas's hand moved to the emergency ascent trigger without conscious decision and then stopped, because Mira was already shaking her head at a secondary screen that showed sub-2. The second submersible had gone completely dark, transponder, drives, everything, and it was not a voluntary shutdown. Something had hit it with a directed electromagnetic pulse. Lior and Sina and the 4 researchers in sub-2 were sitting unresponsive on the trench floor. Sina was in that sub. "You're the mining operation," Jonas said. "I'm the security contractor protecting a legitimate extraction claim. You've wandered into a designated operational area, Dr. Vale. This is a courtesy notification." A pause. "I'm Montes." The name meant something. It took Jonas 3 seconds to place it, because 3 years ago he had filed a complaint with the Cooperative Enforcement Division about a deep core extraction operation that had been running illegal surveys in a protected biosphere on a different world entirely. The contractor had been identified. The case had been referred to the Outer Reach Jurisdiction Board, which had jurisdiction the way a photograph of a fence has jurisdiction. Nothing had happened. Apparently nothing had happened to Montes's career trajectory either, except that he had found new investors. "You know you've breached the survey exclusion," Jonas said. He kept his voice even. "This is a protected." The exclusion was filed under provisional status pending the next cooperative review cycle, Mont said. "That review has been delayed. The legal opinion I operate under says this zone is open. My lawyers are very good. Your drilling is going to destabilize the eastern thermal ridge. The structural survey we filed 18 months ago has been noted." Another one, this one felt different, colder. "Dr. Vale, the people upstairs you've been dealing with don't want the cooperative survey team filing additional structural reports. They've told me this in fairly plain language. I want to be honest with you about your situation." Jonas looked at Mira. She was very still, watching him. "The rescue pod on the vault has been reported as non-functional," Montes continued. "Software issue. Very unfortunate. I understand your team up there has been working on it. These things take time. So there was a source inside the vault. That was the encrypted relay buoy. That was the deleted security footage that Cassian had mentioned 3 days ago. The 40-minute gap that Dov had attributed to a sensor glitch, and Jonas had quietly filed for review. That was Sina's sub going dark. Someone with inside knowledge had targeted it specifically, not Jonas's sub, because Jonas's sub carried the primary survey data that someone still needed to acquire or destroy through official channels. He processed this in approximately 2.5 seconds. "How long do we have?" he asked. The silence on the other end was a fraction of a second too long. Montes hadn't expected that question. He'd expected negotiation, or argument, or the particular flavor of technical objection that scientists offered when they were hoping that being right would matter. "I'd suggest you get comfortable," Montes said finally. The channel closed. Jonas was already moving. "Emergency suit locker. Both of us now." Mira didn't ask why. She was moving before he finished the sentence, which was one of the things he valued most about her. The emergency exosuits were designed for exactly this scenario in the narrow technical sense. Hull breach or vehicle failure at depth, without being designed for the scenario in the broader human sense, which was, you are 14 kilometers deep on an alien world. Your rescue vehicle has been sabotaged. Your colleagues are stranded in a non-functional vehicle 900 meters away, and the apex predator of this ecosystem is somewhere in the water, and you cannot track it because you've lost your active sensors. The suits were rated to 8 hours of operation at this depth. They were equipped with short-range acoustic communicators, directional thrusters for fine maneuvering, and a single emergency flare that would, in theory, attract attention from the surface platform. In practice, they would attract the attention of every electroreceptive organism within 2 kilometers. The suits were not armed. Jonas sealed his helmet, ran the pressure check, and looked at Mira through the faceplate. She gave him a small, precise nod. She had the same expression she wore when adjusting the descent angle. Fully occupied, nothing wasted, the specific face of a person who had made their decision and was now simply executing it. He loved that face. He had never told her that. He filed it in the compartment with the nightmare about the color of the water and the memory of Dr. Raya Haiku's last transmission, and he opened the airlock. The trench floor received them. Walking on the floor of the veteran trench in an exosuit was not walking in any sense that the word implied. The suit's thrusters handled the movement, But the gravity here, Vethara was a larger world than Earth, pulling at 1.3 standard, pressed on the suit's joints in a way that the designers had clearly calculated at a desk somewhere and not in the field. Each step was a negotiation. The bioluminescent colonies on the rock faces provided light that was genuinely beautiful and entirely inadequate. Jonas's helmet display gave him a forward visibility of 18 meters before the particulate in the water absorbed the suit's exterior lighting and returned nothing. They moved in the direction of Sub-2's last known position. Jonas counted his steps and tracked the suit's internal compass and thought about nothing except the next 18 meters. At the 400-meter mark, Mira touched his arm. She pointed. A snapper. That was the survey team's name for the smaller predators of the trench ecosystem. Bilaterally symmetric, roughly 2 meters long, with chemoreceptive organs along their lateral line and a jaw mechanism that could open to approximately twice their body width. They had been documented as opportunistic scavengers, unlikely to attack large moving targets. This profile had been compiled from passive acoustic observation and 0 direct contact events, which in hindsight was perhaps an insufficient dataset. There were 3 of them. They were between Jonas and Sub-2. They were not moving. He and Mira stopped. The snapper's chemoreceptors could detect bioelectric signatures through the suit material. They were looking at Jonas and Mira with sensory organs that Jonas's brain insisted on processing as eyes, even though they were not eyes. And the quality of that attention was something he could not describe except to say that it had weight. He reached into the suit's equipment bay. The exosuit had not been designed with weapons. It had been designed with tools. Jonas had the sampling arm, which had a reach of approximately 80 centimeters, and was designed to collect geological specimens from surfaces the suit couldn't safely touch. He had the emergency lighting array, which could produce a directed beam intense enough to read by at 40 meters. He had the acoustic communicator, which broadcast at 220 decibels, and was intended for emergency distress signals. He raised the acoustic communicator, pointed it at the 3 snappers, and broadcast the emergency distress signal at full power. The sound hit the water like a physical event. The snappers convulsed and scattered. Startle response, pure reflex, the same neurological wirework that made every prey animal in every biosphere flinch from sudden acoustic stimulation. They were gone in 4 seconds, vanishing into the dark in 3 different directions. The signal would also have been audible to every other organism in a 2-kilometer radius. He looked at Mira. She shrugged, which was visible even through the exosuit. They moved faster after that. Sub-2 was sitting at a slight list on the trench floor. No lights, no visible damage. Jonas reached the outer airlock, found the manual release, and keyed the emergency override. The lock cycled. Inside, in the emergency lighting of a vessel running on backup power, Lior and his team were conscious and not injured. Sina was in the observer bay, strapped in, holding a geological sample kit she'd borrowed from the equipment locker, and looking at Jonas with the specific expression of someone who knew they were in trouble, but was currently too grateful to care. That was an EMP pulse, Lior said. I know. From the structure to the northwest, I know that too, Jonas. Lior's voice was careful. The systems I can bring back online, the passive sensors, they're showing something. The geological survey buoys we placed last month along the eastern thermal ridge. Several of them have gone offline. The ones nearest the drilling apparatus. Jonas went still. The structural survey, the 18-month-old report. The eastern thermal ridge was the primary geological containment feature of the trench's chrono-isolated ecosystem. The reason the thermocline had stayed intact for hundreds of millions of years. It was not exactly fragile, but it was in a specific kind of balance, and the drilling apparatus he'd seen attached to its base was drilling into precisely the kind of load-bearing substrate that his structural report had flagged as critical. How long? He asked. Lior looked at his instruments for a moment. That was too long. If they continue at the rate the survey data suggests. He stopped. I don't know exactly, but I don't think it's going to be days. The explosion, when it came, was not from the drilling. It was from Montes. The acoustic signal hit them like a physical blow even through the sub's hull. A deep concussive detonation from the direction of the mining station. Jonas, watching the passive sensor feed, saw the return signal that meant the mining station's crew section had gone dark. All of it at once. Montes had triggered his own demolition charges. He had killed his crew rather than let them be found. And then the eastern thermal ridge, destabilized by 6 months of drilling and shaken by the overpressure wave from the explosion, began to move. What happened next? lasted approximately 4 minutes and felt like much longer. The submersible was picked up by the pressure wave from the ridge collapse and carried 300 meters before Lior got the drives online and regained control. 2 of the research team members were injured, one seriously. The trench floor became a chaos of suspended sediment so dense that the exterior lights showed nothing but a wall of beige-gray particulate, and the acoustic sensors showed the ridge failure propagating outward in both directions from the blast epicenter. When the sediment began to settle, Jonas took stock. Sub 2 was functional but damaged, drives at 60%, hull integrity at 83%. The mining station was gone. Monty's sub was gone from the sensor picture, which meant either it had been destroyed in the explosion or it had already ascended through the thermocline. Sub 1 was somewhere in the debris field to their northwest, last position unknown. The vault was not responding on any channel, and the passive sensors, which were the only sensors they had, were showing something else now. Something that had not been on any of the earlier readings. Multiple large acoustic returns in motion from the direction of the collapsed ridge. The thermocline. The blast had fractured it. Not permanently. The thermal chemistry would reestablish itself over hours, maybe days. But right now there was a gap. And the Heiku, the 3 adults that Jonas reports had warned about and that the council had noted with concern, were moving toward it. We need to ascend, Jonas said. Now. Everything we have. The hull damage. I know about the hull damage. We need to ascend faster than the hull damage matters. Lior looked at him for a moment, then nodded. The ascent was 14 kilometers. At Sub 2's compromised speed, it took 93 minutes. For the first 40 of those minutes, the passive sensors showed the 3 Heiku signatures converging on the fractured thermocline behind them. Then the signatures passed through it and continued upward. Jonas watched this and felt something cold settle in his chest. That was not quite fear. Was something older than fear. Something that humans carried from the long ago, when the dark moved and the things in the dark were real, and there was nothing between you and them except your wits and whatever you happened to be holding. He looked at his hands. He was holding a geological sample kit that Sina had handed him sometime in the last hour. He turned it over. It was a standard survey kit, designed to be sturdy enough to take core samples from rock faces under pressure. A pneumatic driver, a set of carbide-tipped extraction rods, a chemical analysis strip, and a pressurized canister of marker dye used to tag sample sites so the survey drones could relocate them. The pressurized canister was rated to 30 atmospheres. He spent the next 43 minutes modifying things. Mira found him at it and watched for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Are those going to work?" "I have no idea," Jonas said. He crimped the last connector on the 3rd improvised charge. A carbide rod fitted to a marker canister, with the pressure seal modified to vent on impact rather than on trigger pull. The whole assembly lashed to the pneumatic driver's launch mechanism with the sample kit's cable ties. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing you could write a procedure for or train someone on or file a technical document about. It was the kind of thing you built, because the alternative was having nothing. "They might just detonate when you fire them," Mira said. "That would also solve the problem, technically." She almost smiled. The vault was visible from 2 kilometers out, and it was clearly wrong. The platform lights were irregular, some sections dark, some at emergency power. The communication array showed physical damage. As they drew closer, Jonas could see the support struts of the rescue pod bay and the absence of the rescue pod itself, which had departed on an unauthorized trajectory approximately 2 hours earlier, according to the timeline he was constructing from what Callan had managed to transmit on a narrow-beam laser communicator before the main systems went down. The message was short. It said, "Jess, sorry, 3 gunmen, comms jammed, Driscoll is here. There's a resort island." Then it ended. The resort was called Fun Station. It was 17 kilometers south of the vault platform, a commercial development operated by one of the cooperative's private tourism concessions. Shallow water diving experiences, bioluminescent night tours, the sort of thing that the brochures called the wonder of an alien ocean. It had a current population of approximately 300 tourists and 72 staff, who were at this moment entirely unaware that the thermocline rupture had not yet resealed, that 3 Heiku adults were now in the surface waters of an ocean they had never inhabited before, and that the entire contents of the Veteran Trench's chronostated ecosystems were following them upward through a gap that grew a little wider with every hour. Jonas raised the platform on emergency laser relay. Dov answered, which meant Dov was alive. He reported two things in rapid succession. First, that Jess, the comms technician who had been with the survey mission for 11 months, had departed on the rescue pod with two of Montez's people and access credentials that should not have existed. Second, that Cassian had disabled 3 gunmen through a method that Dov described as extremely creative and involving a pressurized nitrogen line, and that Jonas decided not to ask further about. The resort, Jonas said. I know, Dov said. The creatures are already in the surface water. I know that too. Can you reach them? Their comms are jammed. Driscoll has a relay buoy up there somewhere. Montez is already at the resort. He surfaced 40 minutes ago. He's ahead of us. Ahead of them, at a resort full of tourists, with mercenaries and a personal vendetta and 3 apex predators in the water and a giant cephalopod. The acoustic sensors had picked it up on the ascent, 80 meters across. The kind of creature that had been hypothesized from the trench's thermal chemistry, and that Jonas had filed a report about being likely present, a report that the council had noted with concern, and a swarm of snappers that had followed the warm water gradient upward, and were now in a surface environment for the first time in their evolutionary history. He had 3 improvised harpoons made from sample kit components. He had Mira and Lior and Sina and 3 researchers, one of them injured. He had Sub-2 at 60% operational capacity. He had the specific practiced calm of a person who has spent years doing dangerous work in isolated environments and knows that calm is the only resource that doesn't run out. He also had, in the equipment bay, a jet propulsion dive sled that Sina used for her surface survey work, which could do 40 kilometers per hour in a straight line and was absolutely not designed to be used as a combat vehicle against a 48-meter apex predator. He found himself humming something as he prepped it. It took him a moment to identify the melody. An old folk song, something his grandmother on a stringed instrument he couldn't name, in a house that no longer existed on a planet he had left at age 7. He didn't remember the words. He wasn't sure there had been words in a language he spoke, but the melody was there, sitting in his hands and his chest, the way melodies do, and he hummed it while he checked the improvised harpoons for the 4th time, and the sub made its best speed toward Fun Station. The resort came into view from 3 kilometers out, and Jonas could see the water was already wrong. The color was wrong, the particular opalescent quality that the bioluminescent organisms produced when they were disturbed, a shimmering visual static that turned the normally clear surface water into something that looked like a disrupted hologram. Things were moving in it. Large things and small things, and the frantic, non-directional movement of people in water who have encountered something they don't understand. He had been humming the melody. He stopped. Mira takes the sub in, he said. Get close enough to offload people onto the resort platform. Lior, you coordinate the evacuation. Sina, I'm coming with you. You're not. You need someone to drive the sled while you. Sina, he looked at her. She looked back at him with the particular stubbornness that he recognized, because he saw it in her every day. Had been seeing it since she was old enough to have opinions about things. The same stubbornness that her mother had had, and that had been one of the things that made her extraordinary, and ultimately one of the things that had gotten her killed. Stay with Mira. Help with the evacuation, that is what I need from you. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she nodded, once, with the same precise quality she'd inherited from people he missed. He took the sled and the harpoons and went. The surface of the Vetheran Ocean at 1630 local time was streaked with late light in colors that the human visual system processed as beautiful regardless of context, amber and deep violet, and the particular gold that meant the primary star was at the horizon. Jonas registered this the way he registered most things at this point, which was to say he registered it and filed it and moved on. He could see 3 distinct high-IQ signatures from the surface now. They were visible as disturbances, as shadow and surge, and the panicked movement of everything else in the water moving away from them. The resort's shallows were chaos. Mercenaries on the platform firing weapons into the water at things they couldn't kill that way. Tourists in the water. Why were there still tourists in the water? Someone should have gotten them out by now. And the snappers moving through the shallows in packs. Their first experience of shallow warm water apparently agreeing with them considerably. Montes was on the platform. Jonas could see him from 200 meters out, directing the mercenaries with the confident gestures of a man who thought he was managing a situation that was in the process of managing him. The largest of the 3 Haikwu, the Alpha, the sensor profile he'd been tracking for 4 years, surfaced 60 meters from Jonas's sled, with the deliberate quality of something that has decided to look at a thing. The wake it generated rocked the sled hard enough that he had to throttle back to keep upright. It was big in the way that made the word big seem inadequate. It was 48 meters of evolved efficiency, no wasted biology, no redundant systems. Every feature a solution to a problem that the trench had posed over a timescale that made human history look like an afternoon. It turned toward him. He had 3 harpoons. The first one he fired at 60 meters and hit. The carbide tip punched into the leading edge of the pectoral fin, and the canister vented at 30 atmospheres in a directed cavity that expanded against the hydrostatic resistance of the surrounding water in a way that was technically a hydraulic rupture event, and practically meant that the Haiku's electro-reception system on that side went silent for the 5 seconds it took the creature to process what had happened and respond. 5 seconds was enough to move. He was already at full throttle, the sled skating across the surface, the Haiku surging under him close enough that he felt the pressure wave through the hull of the sled and the hull through his boots, and his boots through the specific electric intensity that you feel when something enormous passes just beneath you. And the only reason you're still alive is that it missed. He circled. The creature was confused, not hurt, not deterred, but the electroreception disruption had interrupted its targeting. He had 2 harpoons left. The second one he used on the beta male, which was pushing toward the resort's crowded shallows with the patient, purposeful movement of something that has found a reliable food source. He hit it at 40 meters, same target geometry, same result. The creature veered. It did not flee. Creatures like this did not flee, but it veered, and veering was enough. He had 1 harpoon and 1 hayek, and no more tricks from the sample kit. Montes came off the platform on a secondary sled. Jonas saw him from 200 meters out, coming fast, armed with a close-quarters pulse weapon that was designed for use in pressurized environments and would do exactly nothing to the Haiku, but would do a great deal to Jonas. He thought about what he had. He had 1 harpoon in a sled and the knowledge, accumulated over 4 years of observation, that the Haiku tracked by electroreception and that the strongest bioelectric signature it could detect at short range would be an unshielded human nervous system at high metabolic load, at fear, essentially, or at the physiological equivalent of fear. He thought about this for approximately 1 second. Then he went straight toward Montes. Montes didn't expect it. Whatever he had planned, whatever script he'd written for this encounter, it didn't include Jonas Vale accelerating toward him. He had time to level the pulse weapon, and Jonas had time to see him doing it, and then Jonas cut hard left at 20 meters, and the pulse blast went wide. And Jonas came around in a tight arc that brought him back toward Montes from the wrong angle, and Montes was still turning, still recalculating, the sled not designed for that kind of maneuvering. The Haiku was 20 meters below them. Jonas could feel it. He could feel it because he knew, from 4 years of data, and 3 descents and 17 reports that nobody had sufficiently listened to, that this specific animal, this alpha, this particular enormous sovereign of the deepest dark, oriented on the largest and nearest thermal and bioelectric signature when its electroreception was operating normally. He knew that Montes's pulse weapon was shielded, that his own dive sled was shielded, that the only unshielded source of bioelectric signal in this immediate area was Montes himself, operating at extremely high metabolic load, standing on a vehicle that was not moving, having just discharged a weapon, radiating the specific electromagnetic fingerprint of a human body under extreme stress. Jonas came in from behind him. He came in fast and low, and he hit Montes's sled from the rear at an angle that sent both of them spinning, and in the chaos of it he grabbed Montes's arm, not the weapon arm, the off arm, the one that shot out instinctively for balance, and he held it, and they were both in the water for 3 seconds before Jonas got a hand on the sled and hauled himself up. Montes was in the water for 3 seconds. The Haiku came up from below. It was not the kind of death that Jonas would have wanted for anyone. But it was fast, and it was complete, and it was over. And Jonas sat on the sled in the golden light of the Vetheron evening and looked at the place where Montes had been, and felt nothing for a moment except the specific, terrible clarity that comes after something you can't undo. Then he picked up the last harpoon and went back to work. The giant cephalopod, 80 meters of tentacle and chromatophore and Precambrian patience, surfaced beside the resort's main deck and wrapped itself around the platform's support struts with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Lior and Dov, who had reached the platform by then, managed to run a current through the struts from the resort's emergency power system that was unpleasant enough to persuade it to release. It released in the direction of 3 of Driscoll's remaining mercenaries. That was the last anyone saw of Driscoll's remaining mercenaries. Driscoll herself, the investor, the money, the person who had signed the authorization that sent Montes to the trench with a drilling rig and a demolition crew, and a mole inside the cooperative's own survey mission, was found by Cassian in the resort's service corridor, having retreated there when the snappers overran the main platform. She was sitting with her back against a bulkhead and her very expensive environmental suit's external sensor suite, reading everything the suit's designers had intended it to read, which in this environment was a great deal more than she had intended to learn about the Vetheran surface ecosystem. She was going to cooperate with the subsequent investigation. This was not in significant doubt. The third hake, the female, the one that the early survey data had originally designated, before the reproductive aggregation event complicated matters, surfaced near the evacuation boats and then did not attack. It circled. It came close enough to the hull of one of the boats that the people inside it held their breath as one organism, and then it went still, and it stayed there. Jiming Zhang, who had been working with the original survey team on Vetheran ecosystem behavior for 3 years, and who had a theory about the Heiku's electroreception that he had never quite gotten the council to fund properly, stood at the rail of that boat and looked at the creature for a long time. He lowered one hand to the water. The Heiku's sensor organs, distributed along the lateral line of its enormous form, oriented on the signal. It was not domestication. It was not communication in any meaningful sense. It was the particular kind of contact that happens when 2 forms of intelligence, evolved in entirely different contexts and operating on entirely different principles, happen to find a moment of mutual recognition. Juming kept his hand in the water for 43 seconds. The Hayek stayed. Then it went back down toward the dark where it belonged, and the boat full of people exhaled. Jonas Sina on the platform where she had spent the last 2 hours helping tourists get to the emergency assembly areas, doing it with a calm and competence that the resort staff, trained for emergencies that did not include apex predator incursion from a chrono-isolated deep trench ecosystem, had been very grateful for. She was sitting on a railing at the edge of the platform watching the water. He sat next to her. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know. Is it bad?" "I don't think so." She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the water. The light was almost gone now, the primary star fully set, the secondary giving everything a color that was not quite any color Jonas had a name for. "She would have been here," Cinna said. "It was not a question, yes," Jonas said. "She would have known what to do." He thought about this, honestly, the way he tried to think about her mother honestly, without the softening that grief applied over time to everything it touched. She would have had 6 plans, and 3 of them would have been terrible, and 1 of them would have been right in a way nobody else would have thought of. Sina almost smiled. Which one would you have told her was terrible? Probably the right one. She was quiet for a moment. The council is going to want a report. Yes, they're going to want to know how this happened. Yes. Jonas looked at the water, at the faint bioluminescence beginning to appear near the surface as the disturbed organisms settled back into their rhythms. They're going to express concern. They're going to note the findings. They're going to ask what additional measures should be put in place. And then I'm going to tell them, Jonas said, very clearly, one more time, what is down there and what it requires. And they're going to listen. You've told them before. I know. He reached into his suit pocket and took out the melody that had been with him all afternoon. The nameless folk tune in a language he didn't speak from a house that was gone. He found himself humming it again, very quietly, not for anyone else, just to have it, just to hold it in his chest the way humans hold things. Small, portable, indestructible. But now I have better evidence. The water was settling. The bioluminescence was coming back in slow, beautiful waves across the surface of the Vetheran Ocean, the way it always did when the disturbance passed, the way living systems always do. Not forgetting, exactly, but continuing, because continuation is what living systems are for. Somewhere 14 kilometers below them, in the dark where the light never reached, and the pressure was enough to crush anything that hadn't been built specifically for it, the trench was still full. The thermocline fracture would seal, the ecosystem would recalibrate. The things that lived in the deep would return to the deep, some of them, maybe not all of them. Jonas sat on the railing with Senna beside him and the survey report forming in his mind, the one he was already writing. The one that would be 17 pages long and include 4 diagrams and a structural analysis and a section he was already titling Recommendations. Mandatory. In not font size used for any section in any report he had ever written. The one that was going to be read. The one that was going to be listened to. The one that was going to start with the simple, documented, incontrovertible fact that humans had descended into the darkest trench of an alien world, on foot, under 14 kilometers of water, through predators and pressure, and the deliberate sabotage of the people who were supposed to be keeping them safe, and walked out.